Thank you, Brooke. Brooke brought me some champagne to get going. Thank you all for coming. It's really lovely of you to show up. Thank you for supporting this, PRS, and everything that you do here. To Brooke and Kelly, Greg, who isn't here, but who has been encouraging me to do this for a while, Wes, for running everything tonight. It's my pleasure to be here to talk about Dionysus. He's one of those gods that we all know, at least by name, probably, maybe by his Roman name of Bacchus, and he's probably best known as the god of wine, which makes him very popular. Hopefully I'll remember to keep changing my slides. But he's also a god of a lot of other lesser-known things, probably the widest variety of things out of all the Greek gods. So I'll be highlighting several of these in order to support a somewhat unique claim that he's also, and I think primarily, a god of aesthetic experience. So the Dionysus that I'm presenting is largely the Greek version, but it also includes the Dionysus of Nietzsche, of James Hillman, the legends of Jim Morrison or Dennis Hopper, because these are all as much a part of his mythos as any at this point. And I think that's fine because the god has always been a dramatic shapeshifter, even in ancient times. So aesthetics meaning what? The term aesthetics came of age in the 18th century when Alexander Baumgarten used it to designate a philosophical discipline for examining artistic sensibilities rather than intellectual knowledge. When we hear aesthetics today, we probably think of a sense of design or style or an analysis of form or beauty. It's become a rather dry, maybe even an irritating word for people, which I understand. But the original meaning of aesthetics is, I think, really inspiring. So it comes from the Greek aisthesis, which means to sense and perceive, and it indicates to breathe or gasp in. So it's that aha moment in which meaning is immediately felt before it's rationally comprehended or reflected upon. So you don't have myth or creation or ideas or any other category of experience without an aesthetic element. It's the way that things appear to us and our primal human condition as reactive beings in a phenomenal world. So we exist within and through aesthetic experience. As a central and permeating nature god, Dionysus speaks to this. He also speaks to that specific type of aesthetic experience that is aesthesis, the more peak experiences that are known by intense affect and even transformation. So where such experiences come from is limitless. They might be subtle, they might be high octane, they might be imaginal or concrete, sublime or everyday, the last of which I'll be focusing on. Dionysus mythologizes a very wide spectrum, and that's kind of part of his thing. And I think it's also why he often has a band of followers in his wake, a whole theasos, including other figures who support this whole aesthesis thesis, as I'll show. So in any case, Dionysian, or aesthetic experience, always includes an element of strong affect, an intoxicated quality with or without literal wine. And I'm the only one that has it, literally, so. So actually, Bacchus, this is a fun fact, Bacchus is often very drunk. We probably know Dionysus that way, but the Greek Dionysus was said to be drunk only once. Really, he's the intoxicator. He's taking it in as he's taken in by others. So here's a little preview of the themes I'll be moving through. I'll speak for about 45, 50 minutes and then show a 13-minute video, after which we can then talk. And everything I'll show you really amounts to skipping stones over a very thick dissertation that I recently finished. So I apologize if it's an excessive amount of information in this amount of time, but Dionysus is a god of excess, so it's fine, right? Okay. So now, to most richly entertain depth psychology as a depth aesthetics, we should begin in the depths, in the underworld, which is associated with depth psychology's signature notion of the unconscious, which is really just a name for the unknown. Psychology means logos, or speech of soul, and soul is, of course, itself very associated with the depths. So Dionysus is in part an underworld god. He spends part of his time in the underworld and is a guide of the soul in ancient mystery rites. Hold on a second. I missed something. This champagne. I've only had a sip. I turned the wrong page. Okay. Okay, let me rewind just a second, because this is kind of important to me. One big reason that I got into this whole subject was because I wanted to take up the archetypal psychologist James Hillman's hope for depth psychology to also be a depth aesthetics, and to see how this could be mythically qualified. So Hillman was in the depth psychology tradition. A lot of you may know his work. And this is the Freudian and especially the Jungian tradition, though he founded a field within and from depth psychology that he called archetypal psychology. And briefly, this was essentially, I think, kind of a postmodern response, which shifted focus to some more Dionysian ideas, the positives and negatives of fragmentation, a non-judgmental attitude relatively toward pathological content, a drawing of its material expressly from the humanities and the arts as important expressions of psyche, and moving away from more Jungian preoccupations with opposites, striving for wholeness or a capital S self, heroic approaches, moving away from universals to favor more particular images and aesthetic experiences of human and non-human experience over maps of the psyche. So now to entertain depth psychology as a depth aesthetics. So he's in part an underworld god. He spends part of his time in the underworld, and he's a guide of the soul in ancient mystery rites. There he's leading some people off to the ancient rites with a bell. He gave initiates an experience of death while bodily alive and assurance about the value and continuity of life in general. That was the general role of the mystery rites. Heraclitus said that Dionysus is the same as Hades, and Homer that Hades is a place of eternal drunkenness, implying that Dionysus is very present there, and also that maybe wine is like a taste of the afterlife. So here's an image of Dionysus and Hades actually shaking hands. And besides appearing on many wine vessels, he also frequently appears on funerary vessels and ornate Roman sarcophagi. He's also a god of death because he dies, which is very rare for a god. But he's usually half mortal, and I think this is another important reason why people could relate to him so existentially. He's also born in or from death. In the Orphic tradition, he's a child of Zeus and Persephone, Hades' abducted wife and the true underworld ruler. Or more originally, he's a child of Zeus and the mortal Theban Semele. So this story goes that Zeus's wife Hera caused Semele to doubt that her lover was truly the Zeus, and persuades him to prove it by revealing his divine form. He reluctantly does so, and she's incinerated on the spot. But from that fire, a little fetus Dionysus springs out. Zeus sews him into his thigh, and from there he's born again. So he's known as the twice born, at least. Dionysus could serve as a mystery guide because he not only represents certain aspects of death, but he's also the god of indestructible life, or Zoe, the principle of enduring life even through death. The root of mystery means to close, referring to the lips or the eyes, and their opening was then an act of enlightenment or revelation. So these mysteries are still largely a mystery to us, but we do know that something was revealed that assured participants that life goes on, and these rumored revelatory objects are usually Dionysian. There might be a phallus, or a heart, or an element of illumination, or a sexual union that resulted in a symbolic rebirth of a divine child version of the god, seen here. Dionysus' beloved wife, Ariadne, sister of the Minotaur, and whose name means the utterly clear, also sometimes dies, but she then gives birth to their child in the underworld, and she's the only Greek figure of myth to do that. When Dionysus retrieves his scorched mother Semele from the underworld, he gives her a new name meaning ecstasy, and ascends with her to Olympus. So he has this ability to bring life to Hades and return from it with ecstasy, to descend and ascend. There's he and Ariadne ascending. So he can also just as easily return with that darker element of Hades, though, that culminates his madness, which is a thin difference from ecstatic. Dionysus is known for madness. He goes mad and drives others mad, most notably in Euripides' tragedy Bacchae. He dismembers and he gets dismembered. The god is afflicted with his own powers. And though the original Prince of Peace and Joy, he's also a very dangerous god, inciting others to murderous Bacchic frenzy. So there's always this paradoxical element. His wisdom is irrational, based on non-rational modes of knowing, such as aesthetic or sensory, and he proves that the mind, I think, is something to be staggered as much as it is to make sense. The process philosopher Alfred North Whitehead writes that philosophy should begin in feeling rather than reason, because affect both precedes and has a wider scope than cognition, and because cognition is the rarer portion of our experience. So we always feel more than we know, and I think Dionysus would agree with that. But it is important to say that the real enemy of the Dionysian is not the intellect per se. He has an important alliance with Athena too, but a tyranny of reason, or a tyranny of ego, of assuming that you're in full control of rigid structure, authority, normalcy, puritanism. These are the things that he rips apart. And even Plato says that some madness, particularly Dionysus's, is divine. Our psychologically dismembered experiences are as natural to life as death, according to Hillman. They prove that we are multiple, that we're each comprised of many parts, and that through cut openings or wounds we can discover opportunities for new vision, or to live more vividly, as Nietzsche said. One of his epithets is the loosener, so we can come undone with him, but also find a radical freedom to let go. So being torn apart, or tearing apart, being split in this way, is Dionysus's ecstatic condition. Ecstasy comes from ecstasis, which means to stand apart or be displaced or transported out of oneself or mind in some way. So what I like to emphasize here is that aesthetic experience carries Dionysus's ecstatic quality, not because every aesthetic experience brings mind-blown pleasure, but because every time aesthesis takes place, it's a change of place, it's a change of mind, or an instant expansion or deepening of the imagination. So it's the archetypal job of the Hades-Dionysus dyad to pull us into deep experience, even renewal, and then shoot us back to Earth. When he cyclically returns from Earth to Earth from Hades, he brings qualities of the underworld with him: darkness, depth, dreaminess, eroticism, mystery, and strangeness. And when we undergo transformative aesthetic events, they often feel irreducible in some way, as though they come from a kind of beyond, with an element of surprise, a depth of significance, a surge of life, but also maybe one of these brushes with death or madness, something dark. So the sublime is both inspiring and a bit terrifying, and it's the bizarre, pathological images of psychic life that are the ones which most awaken us, in Hillman's view. It's when we're most uncertain that we become most aware. Mystery and strangeness, then, are these hallmark qualities of aesthesis. Philosophers of aesthetics, but also these myths, poets, and our own experiences tell us this, that an encounter with the strange or another often comes with it. And sure enough, Dionysus is known as the stranger, the foreigner who is always arriving or invading from another land, but who is also strangely already here. Confusion is considered a condition of aesthetic truth, as Baumgarten proposed, because it opens us into speculation. The big aesthetic events tend to catch us off guard, even if we've been preparing for a long time. They're not really something that we will to happen, but that happen to us. For Whitehead, spontaneity is the essence of soul. For Plato, who says that philosophy begins in wonder, which Hillman says the same for psychology, insight arrives suddenly, like kindling giving way to fire. The mythologist Carl Karenier, whose book I saw you put out in the bookstore. Oh, really? Cool. Karenier says that religion begins not with faith, but with arresting evidence. And the phenomenologist Michel Dufresne, that art, and I think myth, is a truth founded not primarily on imitation, but on revelation, on a world opened. So Dionysus, god of mystery, revelation, and the lightning strike, has a notorious tendency to burst through into stimulating, attention-demanding presence. We can also amplify this aspect of spontaneous aesthesis through the strange creature Pan, who delighted the minds of all, but especially Dionysus. Pan is hot and bothered, startled and startling. He's a combinational creature of nature and imagination, and gives us this occasion where we can't choose between either, as we really can't in general. Pan has a very sharp eye, and visionary powers. Like all satyrs, he's often gazing or astonished. He has an insatiable need to scan the horizon with his weird goat eyes. Pan and Dionysus are both core to the art of prophetic seeing at Delphi, and Apollo and Dionysus preside over Delphi in turn, but it was Pan who first taught the oracular arts to Apollo. The vapors under which the Delphic oracles perched themselves were even allegedly first discovered by goats. So Pan is driven by a need to see even the nightmarish things, such as himself, that inspire panic. And it's as though his affliction is being all too affected, too overwhelmed by the vision of the world he's embedded in. So because our other senses and inner faculties are as important, we don't want to limit the seeing quality of Pan to literal optics, but there is really something about the eyes when it comes to the Dionysian, and of course sight is a major player in aesthetic experience. Ancients took in the god as wine through vessels adorned with eyes sometimes, which when lifted became masks. Dionysus is known for his dreamy gaze and his knowing smile. Along with satyrs, he's among the only Greek deities depicted face forward on ancient vase painting. In Bacchae, Dionysus tells Pentheus, the dismembered guy you saw a little bit ago, that he will overwhelm him face to face, and Pentheus ends up possessed with a need to see of his own, seeing double and becoming a mirror of the god as the tragedy unfolds. In Orphic myth, no sooner is Dionysus born than Hera sends the Titans to do him in. They bring several objects to distract the baby god while they pull knives on him, but the one that does the trick is a mirror. He's dismembered while he's taken with his own reflection. The Titans proceed to then roast and eat him, but this aroma attracts the nose of Zeus and he zaps the whole crime scene. But it's from these ashes that humans are made, which means we're half Titanic and half Dionysian. And as a kind of mythic foreshadowing before this event, when Zeus first arrives to conceive Dionysus with Persephone, she's also gazing at herself in a mirror. So I think there's this related aesthetic instinct between the two. Dionysus reaches for a mirror that will make his dismemberment possible, just like Persephone reached out for the beautiful narcissus flower that essentially served as a lever to unleash Hades and her underworld abduction. So aesthesis can sometimes take you under. It's not always easy, breezy, beautiful. Narcissus himself, who shares his name with this flower and who's very often conflated with Dionysus, becomes arrested by his own mirrored image and essentially captivated to death. So there's no fundamental reason why beauty is absolutely always good, and there's definitely no moral code when it comes to mythology. But because Narcissus' fascination with his reflection kills him, and because Dionysus' look into the mirror precedes dismemberment, the Neoplatonists construed these myths into allegories that suited their philosophies. Plotinus contends that long ago, our heavenly souls looked down upon the earth and were so enamored of it that they unthinkingly leapt into it, as if into the, quote, mirror of Dionysus. This leap split us off from the unified cosmic intellect and into the lesser sensible world of fragmented multiplicity, which the Neoplatonists and Plato before them considered a mere reflection. Bodily life then becomes a task for reuniting with this original lost cause. But for Dionysus, as we're getting to know him, we can read this descent positively, not as an exile, but as a homecoming into the world of matter, and what David L. Miller calls the kaleidoscopic plurality of the everyday. Dionysus doesn't spend a hell of a lot of time in the heavenly realm. As a trickster god who moves between things, he thrives on and in common with the earth because that is the in-between place, between above and below. In ancient Greece, the most common place also received the most reverence. This was Hestia, goddess of hearth, home, and earth. She's the first Olympian born from Rhea, the earth goddess, and Kronos. And as you may know, Kronos devoured his Olympian children, beginning again with Hestia, who is then the last to pop out when he's first forced to regurgitate them. Hestia was given the first, last, and highest honors at any ancient Greek feast. She's the goddess of the hearth, the actual fireplace that every home and city had, as well as the hearth of the earth and the center of the universe. So in many ways, she's Dionysus' total opposite, who focuses on preserving and keeping the fire in the home going steady, When she is pictured, which is rare, as are stories of her, she's almost totally veiled, a stoic virgin, goddess of hospitality, but also strict limits. No stranger was allowed to penetrate the threshold of Hestia's virginity or her home. But there is one stranger who does enter her territory. And that, of course, is Dionysus. He's also a first and a last, the oldest god mentioned in Linear B tablets, and the newest god, the last added to the pantheon, and then the first torn down when Christianity outlawed his cult. When Dionysus is admitted to Olympus, it's because Hestia gives her seat to him. She was not debased, but with characteristic hospitality, she gives it to him. So Hestia takes him in. She's the act of taking in. She is hardly known or seen, but is also the most well-known thing of all, the home, the place of return. So I like to think that she, goddess of the familiar, and Dionysus, the stranger, joined to create this mythic tandem of Freud's concept of the uncanny, or the strangely familiar, which is a concept he actually contextualized aesthetically. This unlikely pair also demonstrate the importance of the heart to aesthesis. Hestia is the heart, the center of the body, our inner home. When Dionysus is dismembered, the only part that survives and from which he is reborn is his heart. So my work on all of this was most inspired by what Hillman, following Henri Corbin, calls the aesthetic leap of the heart, its movement in aesthesis. And this is a kind of other ecstasis. The heart lights up and leaps beyond us, taking us towards something else. When Hestia, the heart and the earth, takes in Dionysus, she makes room for him, for aesthesis to happen, I think. Dionysus is an extraterrestrial god, and he makes whichever realm he's in otherworldly. He's not only strange as in distant, but as one scholar writes, the strangely epiphanic in the here and now. So I think he's really about this potential for anything in the everyday to suddenly turn and turn us on. He stands for the marginalized people, but also what's on the margins, the peripheries of the everyday that are always there but often pass us by until they don't. This is that ultraviolet concrete part of my title, which is meant to elicit that phenomenon of when we suddenly see differently in a different spectrum, one we don't usually see through but which is always present. So it's beyond the spectrum of normal vision, higher on the chart, but not necessarily ontologically higher, but it changes us. Hillman says the mundane is the scene of enchantment, the real stage of myth. And I've learned that banal originally meant baking day in medieval France. It was the day in which bread wasn't due to the lord of the manor, but could be enjoyed by common people. Whitehead says we are first and foremost beings of affect, born in encounter, created by our aesthetic experiences. Hillman concentrates on beauty as that which incites this aesthetic leap. The mythic figure Psyche, whose name means soul, is beautiful, and she's forced to serve the most beautiful Aphrodite. But she's also punished by Aphrodite quite a bit, and I think this notion is in a way still punishing her, because beauty is a great cause of aesthesis, but I want to suggest that it's Dionysus who most primordially figures our aesthetic response. Besides his also being a gorgeous god of bare, stunning appearances, he's also far more inclusive, as I'll show in a moment, and more loyal to the ugly and the strange, as you can see from his alliances with Pan and his famously ugly teacher Silenus. And this is important because aesthesis includes that which makes us recoil as much as that which makes us fall in love. It includes what's dangerous or traumatic to us as much as what makes us feel bliss. So as I've been hinting already, Hestia is a goddess of the earth as well, and her name is another name for Rhea, her own mother, the earth goddess. So myth is always folding in on itself in these ancestral, incestuous ways. Dionysus is the earth goddess's favorite. When he wanders from land to land in a state of madness, it's the earth who cures him by initiating him into her mysteries. Dionysus's nature is nature. Zoe, the sap and cycles of life, the blooming, buzzing, interpenetrating world, as well as the buzzing bees whose honey produced alcohol before the grapes. He's a god of flora, of trees, ivy, grapevines, and grapes. And fauna, goats, bulls, snakes, and the big cats, lions, leopards, and tigers. He's a god of lightning, earthquakes, fire, mountain rain, the black sun of winter, and the arrival of spring's first flowers. He's also a god of the body. Ecstasy or ecstasis, again, means to stand apart from oneself, but it's another one of these paradoxes because, at least with Dionysus, ecstasy happens through the body. So I've mentioned the Orphic tradition a few times, and many of you probably are familiar with it, but just in case not, in brief, Orphism, the ancient religion, not the Cubist movement, was a late phase and also a rather severe adaptation or violation of traditional Dionysian cult practice and principles. It came of age as the soul began to be imagined as a separate entity from the body, more aligned with a disembodied intellect, which was gaining philosophic and mystic favor as the eternal component of the universe. It became a male-centric religion with ascetic rather than aesthetic goals, striving to get beyond earthly bodily reality. These are some gold tablets with Orphic instruction for how to properly navigate the underworld to achieve immortality. And usually it involves some kind of call and response where you need to give the correct Dionysian answers to Persephone. So Orphism also, though, created a cosmogony in which Zeus was the first god and Dionysus was the final god, and a lot of detail in between. So it did also expand the Dionysian mythos in very interesting ways. But it had body issues, as did Plato, who considered the soul a prisoner of the body's needs and desires, a distraction from intellect. And in a way, I think that we can see the Western philosophical tradition as a reaction for or against the Dionysian, because material, emotional, and aesthetic realities or the mimetic arts are always in flux or deceptive. They could not be trusted and thus became considered inferior imitations of the eternal and unchanging forms or ideas, or at best, particular occasions for universals or even Jungian archetypes to shine through. But Plato recognized the power of the Dionysian enthusiasm for mystic revelation. He just chose to redirect that power to the authority of reason as the irrational component that serves the arrival of mental enlightenment. And this continues with more or less subtle differences for the next few centuries. Nietzsche broke this mold by placing absolute value on the profound surfaces of aesthetic life and on the Dionysian, which he considered a kind of ultimate reality, a play of creation and destruction in which the whole affective system is enhanced and unable not to react. For him, Dionysus is the, quote, genius of the heart and the sacred yes to life that stands beyond good and evil. More recently, phenomenology also made some strides in recovering value for the body and for aesthetics. Rather than questioning whether something is really capital R real and how, phenomenology brackets that concern and grants the phenomenon what it is as an experience. So there are no mere appearances in this branch of philosophy, but this correlationist bent is still usually maintained anyway, and the intellectual human mind is considered the finisher of phenomena. So it's this correlationism and anthropocentrism that Whitehead and contemporary speculative realist philosophers and others seek to get past by deeming aesthetics as a first philosophy. In general, they assert that the world is real in itself, not derivative of abstract forms and not dependent on our thinking of it, all while still wondering after its mystery and entertaining, like Hillman, how we do have a need to know ourselves beyond ourselves. So these latter philosophies, which I thought were important to mention, and a Dionysian aesthetic, in these cases, all types of images and experiences and ideas, because ideas also have different feels and different styles, or potentially affective, revelatory, and transformational. The message of Bacchae is really about the return of the repressed, a warning about repressing Dionysian styles of wisdom during the rise in its time of philosophy. So real versus unreal, noumena versus phenomena, good versus bad. These things don't fly for a god who moves between worlds like Dionysus. Dionysus and Apollo, Nietzsche's a famous aesthetic contrast, are necessary together both in Delphi and the theater. While Apollo is considered a form giver to Dionysus's formless stream, Dionysus is also a form-giving god. He's not anti-form. He's a god of metamorphosis, always taking on new forms and thus preventing stasis. Zeus even shape shifts. This is a gross picture. Through Throughout the entire event of conceiving Dionysus, he changes into all these other Dionysian animals as they're copulating. So Dionysus's wildness is not a permanent state, but always a coming and going, an appearing and disappearing, as Christine Downing writes. And this is something that's also true of Aisthesis. So clearly, a Dionysian aesthetics must accord with the earth and the bodily senses. For Nietzsche, body and psyche are the same. Dionysus is a god of all bodies, but especially women. Female figures, nymphs, muses, and mortals are his equals and allies. Women are most possessed by him. They wait for and help facilitate his return to earth. He's also one of the few gods not constantly violating women, at least until Roman times. He is raised as a girl, disguised from Hera, and male-to-female transvestism is a big part of his rites. He's known as the womanly one, the foreign effeminate, and the hybrid. And his most famous female devotees are the ecstatic Maenads. They dance and shout and play loud instruments and carry the thyrsus, which you can't see here, but I think you saw in the other images, which is the pine cone-topped fennel stalk that is Dionysus' signature prop and which often drips with fire or honey. Their heads sometimes also are on fire. Their shout is even one of Dionysus' epiphanies. The shout was a way that he was present. Maenads' heads are always thrown back like this, as though opening themselves to be filled with ecstasy. And it was a really big deal in the ancient world that women, who otherwise had very little freedom, annually left their homes, at least annually, to participate in his nighttime mountain rituals, emulating these Maenads. So Dionysus is a god of women, but also of the phallus. Phalluses were carried in his processions and implemented in mysteries. Dionysus penetrates himself with a figwood phallus in one myth. His loyal satyrs are almost always pictured erect, as you can see, hopelessly chasing Maenads who don't stand a chance of catching. They can get the nymphs, though. Satyrs teach the young goddess sexual appetite and Silenus the art of winemaking. So though usually highly activated, Maenads and satyrs like Pan are sometimes powerfully still. Dionysian figures are either wild in ecstasy or kind of caught in an aesthetic arrest. The orgy also originates with Dionysus' rites. He's seductive and opening, a god of bodies combining and of eroticism, which like him is close to notions of libido, jouissance, and excess. He's the god who comes, who arrives, but also, pun intended, he's known as the ear splitter and as Bromios the noisy, because like the earth goddess with whom he invents drums and tambourines, he loves noisy music. Bromios also means to shiver, buzz, or tremble. So Dionysus opens the body to an event, or he makes the body an event. And the philosopher Jean-Luc Nancy helped me to see another meaning of the ecstatic when he describes all living beings as, first of all, excited, meaning called outside themselves, summoned to respond to an outside. The body is an immediate mediator. The quality of an event is mirrored, mimicked instantly in our response. It moves when we're moved, or we move because it moves. We don't know. We gasp in, our heart leaps, our eyes widen, our goosebumps rise. So a really big aha for me in absorbing this the past couple of years is that we do not have to consider the archetypal as a universal or original first principle from which symbolic particulars derive, but rather as whatever most impresses upon us in general, what most touches us. And I think the archetypal often loses this touch in its metaphysics. So we can have meaningful phenomenal experience without having to subscribe that power to an ontologically greater being, or create a hierarchy between visible and invisible, because it's not just the meat and potatoes of external reality that affect us, but so do our dreams, fantasies, memories, myths, abstract art, and so on. Dionysus is said to blur the real and the fantastic. And Dufresne has this great quote about there being something in the real which can be said through monsters, metaphor, or simply melody. And inversely, that the song of a cicada can evoke an entire wasteland. So the unreal can feel as utterly real, even more real than anything, and the real quickly becomes surreal. In any case, as Hillman or Miller would say, the task is to confirm the enigma. And this, I think, is the MO of mythopoesis, to weave affirmation of impressive reality while exercising the imagination to better understand an event or emotion, creating new felt realities as we go. Myth is typically regarded firstly as story or narrative, but even these are based in aesthetics, or at least an aesthetic inevitably co-arises with them as a story's descriptive atmosphere. So the mythic and the aesthetic create each other, not always as a full-fledged story, but at least a poetic, emotional, or even theatrical sense of context, genre, or fate. And Dionysus refills his worshippers by sudden arrivals, but also with scheduled communal festivals, ritual, and theater. He is playtime. Hans Gadamer calls play the aesthetic mode, as did Schiller, and ecstasis not a negation of self, apart from oneself, but the positive possibility of being with something else. Not only creators, but spectators too are active agents, and those who take in the event in whom it's remade. Karenye describes epiphany, of which Dionysus had the most and the most names, as that which engenders gesture. In a communally shared event, this mimetic movement becomes a kind of heliotropic field of epiphany gestures, just like Dionysus's arrival engenders a parade. And it's interesting to note that the earliest roots of mimesis are associated with Dionysian sounds. So I work in James Hillman's archives, but I also work with other people's collections, and one of them is Maria Gimbutas. I don't know if you're familiar with her. She called herself an archaeomythologist. But some of these images are from her collection, and I like to share them. This is a figure within a figure that is giving the epiphany gesture, but it's also the shape of a bull's head, and Dionysus is the bull god. There's a singular version, and then this is a tomb where bull skulls were actually mounted on the walls in this configuration that looks as though they're dancing together or holding hands. And it's interesting that the bull head shape also resembles the female reproductive system, which Gimbutas pointed out, and I think is interesting given Dionysus's relationship with women. So as an inclusive and freedom-giving god, Dionysus was the people's favorite, and I think he still kind of is. His events were occasion for the inversion of power, or at least to let off steam until ruling powers could assert themselves again more easily. In any case, slaves, women, and even the dead could participate in his events, to have a catharsis of tragedy or of laughter. As a god of interpenetration and transgression, it's Dionysus's habit to undo strict subject-object distinctions or hierarchies and to disrupt the spell of individuation. So I always like to bring out this quote from Hillman because it almost single-handedly committed me to this path of studying myth and archetypal psychology. And it points to archetypal psychology's project of extending itself beyond the inner psyche and into culture. And of the perspective that culture is as natural as nature. Yeah, you should read it. I won't read it to you. I think that's Dionysus in a nutshell. So Dionysus is at home in the wilderness and the cities, where his theater grew into an institution that changed the whole course of art. While Dionysus thrives in the collective, he does not negate the individual. In his logic, parts are appreciated as parts, an ecstasis of theatrical necessity. Tragedy and comedy originate in rural Dionysian songs and sacrifices, and apparently, according to Karenye, the ancient Greek landscape was full of Dionysian masks just hanging from the trees. Early masks were also made from the dregs of wine, so they were absorbed right into the face. To wear a mask is, of course, to play a role. For Jung and Hillman, therapy begins when one enters the play of psychic life and when we participate not only in life's big productions, but in the theater of the day-to-day. So a mask is another uncanny and a magical thing. It makes another being present in this world without leaving this world, all while retaining a feeling of remoteness. And it's a good metaphor, not only for metaphor, but also for the objects of aesthetic experience. For Hillman, Dionysus is the archetypal figure of metaphor, the mode of poetry and often of myth. He has no singleness of meaning, and like him, metaphors carry across. For Gaston Bachelard, poetry is an instant metaphysics, delivering insight into being and objects at once. So for a little while, I've been expressing the same kind of notion by calling it a concrete poem, a term that I repurposed from the modern art movement of the same name. And I use it to represent that concentrated instant in which an entire mythos feels like it's given in the very medium of the event, in which we don't have to choose between the metaphor or the material. Rather, the medium is the message or the massage, as McLuhan says. We can take anything for the experience that it is, which may include a strong feeling that something divine is behind the curtain. Images do emanate ideas, even godliness. But for those of us who don't follow a religion or a psychology that locates gods behind creation, or a philosophy of idealism, or a science of atomic causality, we aren't left only with data-based sensationalism, but with a sensational world. Dionysus could be the god who rules the world. I don't know. He's ruled me for some kind of real way. But he's certainly a collection of qualities developed over time into a figure who speaks to certain psychological conditions. But he was also considered the actual fire, the bees, the honey, the lightning, the eye, wine, goat, bull, blue, and so on. So the medium is or can be the message. Dionysus is a god of radical appearing, but also in the sense of appearances, the way that things appear and strike us. So, while I've delivered up to this point a more in-depth definition of aesthetics than this sterile, irritating sense of design or taste that we typically know it for, the aesthetic also is a matter of style and taste after all, but in no shallow way. All things have a particular style, a set of qualities, color, light, texture, sound, smell, and so on, ways of moving that affect us in particular ways and that summon us kinesthetically or not, that attract or repel us. And these qualities and manifestations are mythic powers in themselves. They impress upon our senses, minds, and memories and inform the erogenous zones of our personal and collective mythologies. And we know this best not by aesthetic philosophy or ancient stories, but by our own aesthetic reckonings, including our most cherished personal taste of art and pop culture, things that seem to express us and that we want to emulate. To identify with the god who thrills you was privilege number one of Dionysian worship. Aisthesis is related to mimesis in that it's an instinct to express the event, whether it's in the body, automatically, by telling someone about your amazing time, or by trying to create it again in an artistic medium. Dionysus is a god of aesthetics in the sense of affect and of the arts. So there are many, many artists and musicians who demonstrated Dionysian aesthetics, and we could shout their names all night, and we can. Just this week, I shared my work on Dionysus and Hestia with a friend who is doing a podcast on Snoop Dogg or Snoop Lion as a Dionysian figure. And he's very curious, as I think we all are, about his friendship with Martha Stewart. So I suggested maybe it's a Hestian relationship. So in my PhD work, I explored a few visual artists whose art and lives sometimes unexpectedly or paradoxically capture the spectrum of the Dionysian that includes the everyday side, including the anti-structural cabaret-based Dadaist and Marcel Duchamp, who practically arrived like a new god on the modern art scene. But I think I'm going to skip a little bit I was going to say about him. But I will say that I also entertained Dennis Hopper, and he's a much more apparent Dionysian figure, but he also gathers together the spectrum from wild madness to a lesser-known, really sincere fascination with the everyday. He's kind of a satyr. But I can tell you more about that on July 14th, when I show Easy Rider. So the list can go on, and to conclude, I'm going to show rather than tell about a few other figures like this. During my PhD years, I created this montage video that served as a kind of nostalgic touchstone for me to keep in touch with some key Dionysian pop culture icons who gave me those wonderful formative childhood and teenage experiences of aesthesis and who have endured as Dionysian guides in my life. So it needs a little update, but it's got some of the main dudes in it, and it's become like an old friend to me in itself. But before I do that, I do just want to go back to the starting thesis and wrap it up. and say that, yes, I think as Hillman hoped, depth psychology is a depth aesthetics, even a Dionysian aesthetics, which might be a redundant phrase. And as I hope we've seen, the Dionysian is inherently aesthetic, and aesthetics asserts a convincing claim for a native relationship with the Dionysian. Dionysus affirms the full spectrum not only of aesthetic, but of psychic life, of the inseparability between sensory and imaginal, and this may be one reason he quickly becomes a god of all. There are many gods, each with their own style and ability to radically affect presence. But with Dionysus, one is invited to become the epiphany, and he figures affect as a primary natural response, even via another divinity. With his archetype, core aspirations of depth psychology are also enacted. The unknown is brought to life so that familiar and unfamiliar may meet. Depth psychology is a depth aesthetics because aesthetics is our first way of encountering and sensing valuable psychological imperatives. Depth psychology's goal is wholeness, but one that recognizes differentiated, autonomous parts. Its service is to attend suffering and discover joy, which are also Dionysian demands and achievements. The depth of depth psychology is associated with soul, and underworld's not the ego's domain. Dionysus serves psyche by guiding soul to the depths of its destiny while bodily alive, this life. The aesthetic in general, especially regarded in Dionysian light, shows that soul is not only in us, but in the things we share material composition with. Dionysus creates even while destroying, especially destroying unhealthy edifices. And with Dionysus, repression is simply no longer an option. Like the winemaking process, he requires expression. So depth psychology not only can be, but inherently is a depth aesthetics because one can't do without the other. And Dionysus fuels their relationship by demanding that aesthetic styles and affects be acknowledged on the level of godliness. So to officially end, I'm going to tell you the beginning of Richard Brautigan's novel In Watermelon Sugar. Not the whole thing, but just these words. In watermelon sugar, the deeds were done and done again as my life is done in watermelon sugar. And these words have returned to me with more meaning as I've studied everything I've just shared with you. What are we done and done again in? My life is done and done again in Bob Dylan lyrics. In what you'll see in this video, done and done again in Laura Palmer, done and done again in Duchamp's last piece, done and done again in the zoom into Eliot's face before E.T. lifts them into the sky. Done and done again in Dionysus. And we're done and done again in the material aesthetic components of our lives and the emotional effects and sensory memories that can still send us suddenly into reverie. So I am done and done again in what the deeds of my life were done in my dad's Captain Black tobacco smoke, the polyurethane of his workplace, the slamming of the front door, the peeling out of the driveway, the sunset. I'm done and done again in this strange, immersive image of a giant tooth that sometimes seizes me. I'm done and done again in the hot soil of Pennsylvania summers and the way that the leaves turned over before thunderstorms, the soft body of my cat, the coarse texture of my old pony's mane, the unsettling look of disintegrating horsehair plaster walls in my house, the rooftops of Baltimore and the highways of LA, and on and on and on. So you each have your own infinite sets of these things, the things that have written the details of your myths into you, into your bodies and psyches. So I think this is a huge portion of our lived experience that Dionysus gives credence to in all the emotional styles, to the aesthetics of the things themselves, and to our affective experience of the things, whether we're ready for them or not, then as now. So thank you. Okay, so now I can play this video. Oh, here it comes.
All we represent to them, man, is somebody who needs a haircut. Oh, what you represent to them is freedom. What the hell's wrong with freedom, man? That's what it's all about. Oh, yeah, that's right. That's what it's all about, all right. But talking about it and being it, that's two different things.
Welcome, bienvenue, welcome. Fremda, et étranger, stranger. Glücklich zu sehen, je suis enchanté. Happy to see you, bleibe, reste, stay. Willkommen, bienvenue, welcome. Im cabaret, au cabaret, du cabaret.
Ladies and gentlemen, from Los Angeles, California, the Doors!
I'll keep your eyes on the road, you hands upon the wheel. I'll keep your eyes on the road, you hands upon the wheel. Come to the road, that's gonna have a good time. Yeah, back to the road has got some bungalows. Out of back to the road has got some bungalows. Just for the people like to go down slow. Let it roll, let it roll. Let it roll, let it roll. Let it roll, let it roll. Let it roll. All night long. Yeah, man, come on.
I must have some booze. I demand to have some booze.
I wouldn't drink that if I was you.
Why not?
Because I don't advise it. Even the wankers on the site wouldn't drink that. That's worse than meth.
Nonsense. This is a far superior drink to meths. The wankers don't drink it because they can't afford it. Have we got any more? Liar. What's in your toolbox?
We have nothing. Sit down.
Liar. You've got antifreeze.
Bloody fool. You should never mix your drinks.
I'm a mama, papa calling to you. I'm a space invader. I'll be a rock and roller bitch with you. Keep your mouth shut. You smoke me like a big fever, and I'm busting up my brain all over the world. No, I ain't. Keep your electric eye on me, babe. Put your makeup to my press your space gloves to my mouth.
A moment, Janet. We don't want to interfere with their celebrations.
This isn't the Junior Chamber of Commerce, Brad.
They're probably foreigners with ways different than our own. They may do some more folk dancing.
Look, I'm cold, I'm wet, and I'm just plain scared.
I'm here. There's nothing to worry about.
How do you do, I? See, you've met my faithful hand. He's just a little brought down because when you knocked, he thought you were the candy man. Don't get strung out by the way I look. Don't judge a book by its cover. I'm not much of a man, but a lot of things. I'm not a whatever lover. I'm just a sweet transvestite. Come transsexual, transylvanian. hip-hop is a criminal. And all the sinners, saints, senses, tears, the psalmist, and Lucifer, cause I would need some restraint. So if you need it, have some courtesy, have some sympathy, have some faith. Use all your well-learned qualities, or I'll lay you so ways. Oh, yeah. Seems to be true. Don't forget my name. Ah, yeah. But what leads you is the nature of my game. All right. Get on there.
What do you want in here?
Cake. What's it got to do with you?
I happen to be the proprietor. Now, would you leave?
Ah, I'm glad you're the proprietor. I was going to have a word with you anyway. We're working on a film up here. Location, see? We might want to do a film in here.
You're drunk.
Just bring out the cake. Cake and fine wine.
If you don't leave, we'll call the police.
Balls. We want the finest wines available to humanity. We want them here, and we want them now.
Miss Blenner has it. Telephone the police.
All right. Miss Blenner has it. I'm warning you, if you do, you're fired. We are multi-millionaires. We shall buy this place and fire you immediately. Yes, we'll buy this place. And we'll install a fucking jukebox in here. And I when all you stiffs up a bit.
Yeah.
I'm going to stop it there. Yeah. Thank you. So, yeah, so some good Dionysian figures there.